Hello everyone and welcome to this critique video. Today we are going to be taking a look at 3 images that have been sent in by Matt Payne. Many of you will know him from his very popular podcast F-Stop Collaborate and Listen, as well as his incredible color mountain photography from Colorado. Today, however, of course, we are looking at some of his, from what I understand, first steps into black and white photography. So I will say that these are very high caliber level of photography, and so there's not too much by way of composition that I'll be talking about. However, I think there's some editing things that I might personally change myself. So with that being said, let's jump straight in and take a look at Matt's images. To my eye, Matt here has used black and white in 2 different ways. So the first is with the first image and the third image, and he's using a sort of high contrast look here to produce something that's quite graphical and accentuates the forms of the subjects that he's photographing. The second one is a little bit different in that he's using a much calmer, lower contrast feel to evoke a calm morning up in the mountains. This looks like Yosemite. So it's a good example here of the different styles of editing and how they can evoke different reactions from the viewer. And to that end, I think it might be a fun exercise to go through and sort of almost accentuate the edits here that Matt has done to see if that evokes those emotions even stronger. So going into the first image here and taking a look at the raw file which Matt sent in, thanks, by the way, for doing that. It's clear that this was already naturally a very high contrast scene. And so by slightly underexposing to preserve those highlights, he's created lots of deep pockets of black, which, as we can see in his edit, have translated through nicely. And he's done a significant amount here of sort of dodging and burning to bring out a lot of these tree trunks. And to that end, if I jump into the develop module and take a look at the histogram here, all the blacks don't bother me. That's part of the look of the image. The thing that I noticed immediately is that actually we don't have any true whites. And I think he's done that to try and preserve as much detail as possible in some of these leaves. But in my opinion, you could push that a bit further. One of the concepts that I use continually in my editing in black and white is relative contrast. So if we zoom in and we take a look at these deep blacks versus these whites, setting those 2 things against each other is going to make one appear darker and the other appear brighter. And so if we just bump, for argument's sake, the tone curve up here to really push a lot of these whites further towards a true white, we can now start to see, and then switch back, we can now see how these actually look really dull compared to that. So this is obviously quite a brute force way to do things. I might tweak that to preserve some of these mid-tone details, and that would be sort of a minor thing that I would change in this edit. I might also take this over into Photoshop and do a similar tone curve adjustment to some of these sort of gray areas. There's a lot of these mid-tones here that are feeling a little bit gray compared with the top half, which is fairly bright. So it's about creating balance across the scene, but also utilizing that concept of relative brightness to enhance this graphical style. So for argument's sake, bringing this over into Photoshop, well, it's not necessarily a bad thing that we've got some midtones here because it provides a range of values throughout the image. I think this is looking just a little bit dark compared to the nice contrast that we've got up here in the top half of the image. So a curves adjustment with a mask, which of course could be refined further using luminosity masks. But if we just start to bring in some of these values and a bit more brightness and contrast down here, I think it starts to balance the image a little bit better. But overall, there's not too much to change here, and I think it's really quite a strong image. Super quick before I go on to the next image, I would really appreciate it if you considered subscribing to the channel. Thanks. So moving on to the next image here, we sort of shift tact a bit towards something that's maybe evoking a much calmer feel, the fog in the valley, and so a lower contrast edit is appropriate for that feeling, that emotion in the image. So taking a look at the raw file here, an interesting thing that Matt's done here is actually, if we flick back and forth between and take a look at the top left corner, he has slightly stretched this image horizontally in order for this mountainside to more perfectly hit that corner. And essentially what he's trying to do here is create an X composition through the image with the fog here in the bottom right, the mountain top left, and then the competing diagonal of this granite slope. So it's quite an effective way to do things. I guess stretching slightly enhances that when you don't want to have to crop in all the way to there just to get that same effect. I'm not sure if that's entirely necessary. I think you already get a sort of a natural X shape, but nevertheless, it's certainly something that is effective here. Looking at the edit itself, there is a quite a bright spot from looks like some lying snow right on the edge here. So that's something that I might come in with a mask and just look to soften it a bit. So bring down those highlight sliders, bring down the whites, and maybe reduce some of the contrast, and just soften it so that it doesn't detract, or distract, I should say, from the image. The other thing is that, for me, the balance of this photograph is sort of very heavily weighted visually towards the bright fog. Obviously, it's the sense that it's being illuminated by the morning sun, but visually I feel as though you've got sort of a quarter of the image here which is really bright, and it's just sucking my attention into this corner, and all of this wonderful detail on the granite slopes isn't getting the same attention. I feel my eye being drawn down to this corner and sort of stopping there, rather than accentuating that X, which provides leading lines for my eye to flow through the image and notice other details. So to accentuate that sort of X shape, one thing I might do is create some more local contrast between the edges of this slope in the background. So an easy way would just be to create a linear gradient, soften that out a bit, something like that, and then we'll do one more just so that we don't blow out the fog below. Bump up the exposure, add some contrast, something like that. Maybe the blacks aren't necessary, but from before to after, I think adding a little bit of contrast to this foreground rock face actually increases the appearance of depth, because you're going from something with more detail to something with less detail, which is that atmospheric haze, which actually, looking at the raw file again, Matt has taken a lot of haze out from this, so that might be something that I would leave a bit more haze in the background here and do sort of almost localized dehazing to a varying degree, where I've got more in the foreground and then less as it goes through the image, and that's going to really add more three-dimensionality and also enhance that soft ethereal feeling that Matt's trying to evoke here. At the same time, of course, you can't be afraid to add a lot of detail and contrast to something like this, which is absolutely stunning, all of the granite detail there. I might even be tempted in this foreground forest to dehaze it just a touch. You can see as we start to do that, you bring a little bit more detail out in the trees, but I mean literally maybe like 8 points. Just a subtle shift here, I think, helps soften down what is otherwise somewhat distracting in my view. Overall, a great composition and image though. And then moving on to Matt's third image here, this might be my favorite of the three actually. He's really sort of gone for it in terms of the graphical approach. So in the same way that you've got some pure blacks here, I would also not be afraid to have some pure whites. Not too many, of course, then you start to lose some of this really cool detail in these cloud formations. But yeah, you can see here that there is a little bit of room to work with to bring some of these over to the right without blowing anything, which I think just overall adds, again, that idea of relative contrast. The only thing in this image is this little cloud here bothers me somewhat. It's just a bit of a point source of light, so that's something I might go in with either a mask and just reduce the luminosity a bit, or something that you could obviously consider cloning out. If we look in the raw file for a second, we have seen that Matt has extended this shadow, which I think was really a smart move on his part. It's sort of a creative take on this edit, and I think if you're already doing that, then there's nothing that says that you can't deal with this little point source of light. But overall, a really, really strong image here, and overall I would say a strong set of images from Matt. So thanks Matt for sending in these incredible images. I really did have a good time taking a look at them and playing around with some of the edits there. I hope you got something out of this, and to all the rest of you, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.